When you hear of the flying type, you always tend to think of Pokémon that soar through the skies. I mean, the type is even called the flying type, and let's be honest here, the vast majority of these Pokémon look a lot like birds. And even for those of them that don't look like birds, they have massive wings that propel them through the air like Dragonite and Noivern. But that's not always the case. I mean, we just talked about Farfetch'd, who's a flying type, and it barely ever leaves the ground. So, because of these ground-locked flying types, I've started to try and think of the type as Pokémon that can either take to the air, or that are very fast, so as to almost look and feel like they're flying. And that second category is where we find our topic today. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the multi-headed Pokemon Doduo and its evolution Dodrio. Doduo has a very simple body plan. It's got a round central body covered in brown feathers. From there, it has two long spindly legs ending in feet with four wide-placed toes. On top of the body, two thin necks lead to the heads that are pretty much the same as the body, small spheres with brown feathering. Each head has two large black eyes and a thin beak. With this unique physique, Doduo stands at about 4 feet 7 inches tall and weighing about 86.5 pounds. And evolving doesn't change the basic body plan of this Pokemon, though it does add on to it. Dodrio now has 3 heads instead of 2, and each head has a crest made of long black feathers. As well, the main body now has an undercoat of black feathers near the legs and a wide set of reddish tail feathers. It's also taller now, standing an average of 5'11". And all this extra size, and extra body parts, mean that Dodrio now weighs around 188 pounds. In all, it's very easy to see that these guys are built for speed, and that is going to be reflected in their enclosure. So, for those of you that like having a quick-footed Pokemon, let's get into it and see if these guys are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. There are two main things to consider when we build an enclosure for these guys: space to run and social dynamics. Even just by looking at them, you can tell these guys are built to run. No wings, long, strong legs, and Dodrio is even kind of streamlined with the tail feathers and crest feathers. So they need wide open space, almost like the Rapidash line. As well, these Pokemon are very social with each other. In the wild, they travel in groups of 2 to about 20. If you don't have more than one of these guys, then it can lead to health problems like anxiety, nervousness, and depression. Meaning that if you want to keep these guys, you will need a minimum of at least 2 birds. You can keep any gender together, but it is more recommended that you have a male and a female. Males may get aggressive with each other, especially during breeding season. The females might also get aggressive with each other, but not to the level of the males. And just be aware that if you do have a male and a female, you may end up with chicks at some point. Anyway, both of these things together mean that you will need a good amount of space for these guys. If you're sticking with the minimum of 2 Pokemon, then you're looking at an enclosure of 80 feet by 250 feet. Now, I know that seems like a lot of space, but these guys need all that room to run around. And you do need to have one side be much longer than the other, which acts almost like a runway or a racing strip for them to get some good exercise in. And like I said, make sure that the entire enclosure is just a flat field. With them moving at such high speeds, any divots in the ground or excessive obstacles like trees and rocks could be dangerous to them if they hit them at high speeds. When it comes to fencing, you'll want to be sure that you have 2 layers of it. This is a safety measure. That way, in case there's a break in the inner fence or they manage to get through it, they won't be loose. They'll still be in a fence. The fencing should be some high-tension, high-visibility wire. They shouldn't be strong enough to break through it if you get the right stuff. Just be sure that whatever kind you buy The netting is small enough their legs and their beaks can't get caught in it. Along the fence, every 10 or 12 feet or so, you should have a wooden support pole. That way you can add a ton of support to the wire. You also want it to be the high visibility stuff, that way they won't just crash into it while running at top speed. Along the base of the fencing, you should line the ground about 6 inches out from either side with gravel. This will stop plants and weeds from growing along your fence, which just makes your life easier, but it will also keep the ground from being worn down, as the Doduo line, when kept in an enclosure like this, are well known to pace the fence line, which over time could cause a rut to form and the ground to shift. The last part of the fencing is that you'll need a gate so you can get in and out of the enclosure. Well, you'll need 2 gates, one for each layer of the fencing. Again, this is a safety measure, so if they try to squeeze past you through the first gate, they're still stuck in the second layer of fencing. A few final details regarding the outside enclosure. You should be sure that the field has good drainage to it. You don't want water to build up in the pen, as the feathers for these guys have little to no waterproofing. Mud is also very slick, and if these guys hit a patch of it at top speed, then there's a good chance of them sliding and possibly hurting themselves. As well, they like to take dust baths, where they roll around in a dry dirt patch, and they can't do that if the ground is too wet. Aside from the outdoor enclosure, you'll also want to give them an indoor shelter where they can go to avoid inclement weather. Like I mentioned, these Pokemon don't have a thick coating of feathers, and the feathers they do have are not very water repellent or cold insulating. That's why these Pokemon don't do well in very wet or very cold places. If you do live in a place that gets that way a part of the year, then you might be able to house them indoors for that entire season, but the dimensions of the building to do so are so impractical as to be impossible outside zoos and major organizations. So instead, we're going to simply make these holding pens that they can stay in for short periods of time. Unfortunately, that does mean that you won't be able to really keep these Pokemon in any environment that gets too cold or too stormy, but that's an unfortunate side effect of these Pokemon. You're not going to be able to keep everything everywhere, unfortunately. The pens for these guys should be at least 20 feet squared per Pokemon. You need to make sure they have some good air ventilation as well, and plenty of natural daylight for at least 8 hours out of the day. So I would recommend installing some vents and windows that'll let in some sunlight and fresh air, as well as some actual fluorescent lights for when it gets darker out. Of course, it does need to be heated on the inside, and you're going to want to build it out of material that is very easily cleaned. If these Pokemon are going to be housed here, then they're most likely going to be making a mess here. And when I say being housed in here, I don't mean that they'll be sleeping in here at night. They are very comfortable sleeping outside, and so long as the temperatures don't get too low during the night, they should be fine. Normally, I wouldn't recommend this because of predators, but unless you live somewhere with natural populations of Pyroars or Lipards, then there isn't any danger to them. If you do end up living in those places, then you could keep them inside their pens for the night, but you should increase the size of the pen to 30 feet squared per Pokemon, and be sure to let them out as soon as you get up in the morning. The more time they spend outside, the better. Lastly, there aren't that many Pokemon that can be housed with these guys. While they are very social with each other, to the point of needing another Doduo evolution in the same enclosure with them, they really only do well with other grazing Pokemon. A few good examples of this are the Girafarig line and the Blitzel line. The Girafarig line are more often than not very docile and friendly towards people and other Pokemon. The only thing with them is that you will need to be careful with Girafarig's tail, as it's not very bright, and if it senses something that's behind it, then the tail head's going to lash out. If this attack from the tail catches a Doduo or a Dodrio unaware, then it could lead to injury, so be aware of that if you decide to house them together. The Blitzel line could be okay, but it is very well known that the whole line tends to have a temper to it. So if you do plan on introducing them to each other and eventually keeping them in the same enclosure, introduce them to each other slowly, and be sure to get them used to each other first before fully letting them integrate. Especially any Zebstrika that you end up getting. Also, during nesting season, the Doduo line can get kinda testy, so it might also be best to separate them out during that time, especially if you have an egg that they're caring for. And as always, remember that the enclosure that I described earlier is really only designed for the Pokémon that I specified. If you plan on adding any more of this line, or other lines altogether, then be sure to alter and adjust the enclosure accordingly so all Pokémon are happy and cared for. Availability. The thing is that these guys aren't really that common in the wild. For the most part, they tend to stick around the western side of the Kanto region, and I guess technically the eastern side of the Johto region? The Indigo Plateau. They surround the Indigo Plateau, along with underneath and alongside the cycling road between Celadon and Fuchsia City. Also, these are very common Pokemon to stock in Safari zones. They're in the one in Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Kalos. There are records of them sporadically appearing on Route 201 in Sinnoh and Route 12 in Unova, but again, it's very sporadic, and when there aren't those explosions in population, they are nearly impossible to find there. So really, the best thing to do is to get to one of the Safari zones. They're very regulated, it feels like you're out in the woods hunting, but it's totally safe, and if anything goes wrong, there are rangers there to get you out of the situation. Now, if that's not really your thing, then there are ways that you can get one of these Pokemon from someone else. There aren't really breeders for these Pokemon. Well, I guess technically there are, but they're farmers. They raise these Pokemon, breed them, then sell the meat, eggs, and bones for treats for other Pokemon. I'm sure that if you call one of them, explain what you want, then they may be willing to give you a couple of eggs or even some freshly hatched Doduo. I can't guarantee that they'll go along with it, after all these Pokemon are how they run their livelihoods, but if they don't, then you can always find another farm and try them. It's going to be a lot of work, but you should eventually be able to find someone that's willing to sell you some Pokemon. Catchability. A big thing for catching these guys is how fast they are. It's the same issue with the Ponyta line. You have to be able to catch up to them to be able to catch them. So either you have to be able to catch them at full speed, which can be dangerous, or you have to get the drop on them. And good luck with that. Thanks to the extra heads, they always have one on lookout, even when the other heads are asleep. You need to be highly stealthy to be able to sneak up on them. But if you're able to get close enough to throw a ball at one of them, then a Pokeball or a Great Ball would be best for Doduo, and for Dodrio, absolutely go with an Ultra Ball. A Fastball could be effective against a Dodrio, as they are pretty speedy, but I'm not sure how effective they are compared to an Ultra Ball, so that's something you guys will have to take into consideration yourselves. Care. Alright, so I know they haven't really played a factor in the guide so far, but now is when we have to start thinking about the multiple heads thing. Really, it's mostly a concern for Dodrio, as both of Doduo's heads tend to get along. But there are the odd case of two Doduo heads not getting along, so while I will be mostly talking about this stuff in regards to Dodrio, any of the techniques that I mentioned could be used for Doduo as well. So the major issue with the three heads is the fact that instead of getting along like its pre-evolution does, they each have their own developed personalities and thought patterns, and like anyone that has to be stuck in an enclosed space with their siblings for a long period of time, they're going to fight with each other. This is the most prevalent when it comes to food. Speaking of which, when it comes to feeding these guys, you want to make it a good mix of leafy greens like spinach, lettuce, and cabbage. You should also add in a small amount of fruit and a bit of insect meat as well. Not too much. I would say that the majority of the meal should be reserved for the veggies, with only about a quarter of the meal being a mix of fruit and meat. For a Doduo, you'll need about 3 pounds of food a day, and up that to 5 pounds a day for a Dodrio. This should be split into 2 meals throughout the day, one in the morning and one at night. But you will also need to split each meal into equal portions for each head. It's not a necessity as they all share the same stomach, but each head does enjoy the feeling of getting a meal, so it's recommended that you do it. And you will definitely know when these guys get hungry. Not so much for a Doduo, but for a Dodrio, the heads will start to fight with each other if they get hungry. When you see this, it's best to feed them their meal right then, or at least give them some snacks to tide them over until mealtime. Because if the heads really start fighting with each other, then it could lead to some problems. Those beaks are sharp, and if turned on each other in such close proximity, they can be very damaging. Which I think is a good segue into what kind of training you'll have to do with these guys. The most I'm going to get into in this guide is getting the Pokemon used to you being around them and comfortable with your presence. But there are certainly people out there that have worked with these Pokemon well enough that they can get them to do tricks and even ride them around, though I can't imagine that it's as comfortable as riding a Mudsdale or a Rapidash. If you want to, you could go that far, but you have to go to someone who knows much more about these Pokemon than I do. As for right now, we'll begin with how you should approach these Pokemon. One major thing to keep in mind whenever you approach these Pokemon is that you have to be able to recognize when they're on high alert. If they have all of their heads up and looking around, then it might be best not to go near them right then. It means that they're looking around for threats and they don't feel safe at the moment. If you approach them when they're like this, especially when you're still new to them, they may get spooked and attack you. Just to avoid even the possibility of that, it's best for you to wait until they're in a less stressed, less alert state. When that happens, you need to be sure to approach them in a confident and sure manner. Don't rush or make any sudden moves, but they will be able to sense any fear or anxiety in you, and at that point, they won't respect you enough to let you near them. So confidence, strength, self-assuredness. Arceus, I sound like a motivational speaker, but it's honestly a necessity whenever you approach these Pokemon. Once you get near them with that confident swagger in your steps, you want to start by showing them you have treats for them. The best thing to use for these treats are either bits of veggies or bits of fruit. You could use insect meat, I guess, but due to the limited amount of it in their diet, it could be a bit much using it in both treats and in meals. So I would recommend just sticking with the veggies. Using these treats, start by simply throwing one of their feet from about 5 or so feet away. This will pull double duty, showing them that you are the one that brings the food, and that you're the one to be trusted, that you aren't there to hurt them. Do this a few times, and then try to get closer. They may still be slightly skittish towards you, and if that's the case, then simply keep giving them snacks from a distance and try again at a later date. If they do allow you to approach, then your next goal is to get them comfortable with you touching them and petting them. Again, we're just going to keep rewarding them with food, reinforcing that calm, good behavior while you're touching them. When you do this, I would recommend that you wear protective gear in the beginning. Their beaks are sharp, as I've mentioned before, and especially with Dodrio, one head might like you where another head doesn't. You can't get complacent just because the one head is really well behaved. Only when you've been working with the Pokemon for a while and you're sure that all the heads are more likely to listen to you than to go after you, then you remove the protective gear. And that's really it. Like I said, this is really just basic get to know your Pokemon stuff. Things that these farmers that have large flocks of these Pokemon do. If you want to do something more intense with them than that, you'll need to get in contact with someone who knows more about them. Lastly, we're just going to talk about a few minor tips and tricks for these Pokemon. Like the fact that these Pokemon have a dominant head that controls the body. Look for the head that has the thickest neck and seems to be in charge of the other heads. It may take a bit of watching to notice, but eventually you should see that one head seems to be more in sync with the body's movements than any of the others. And this goes for Doduo as well as Dodrio. Recognizing which head is in charge of the body can help you in the training by allowing you to try and predict what the body's going to do, so you don't get spooked if they suddenly take off on you during training. When you do get one of these Pokemon, there is a slight benefit to getting a farm-raised one. When these Pokemon hatch, many farmers allow them to imprint on them. This not only makes them easier for the farmers to train, but it also makes them much friendlier to people in general. So that is a bit of a benefit to getting a farm-raised one if you're thinking about going that way. Cost. The enclosure for these guys is going to put you in the very high category. Because of the sheer size of the enclosure, the fencing alone will cost you a ton. Yes, it is the wire fencing, which is cheaper than your normal picket fence, but just the sheer amount is going to be a lot. Combine that with the holding pens and the gravel you'll need along the fencing, and you're looking at a lot of money. Food will be the cheapest thanks to the fact that it really is just stuff that you can get at the grocery store. Well, maybe not the insect meat, but you understand what I mean. Really, the only thing that's going to make the price go up is the amount. 3 to 5 pounds of food a day is no joke, and the fact that you have to have at least 2 of these Pokemon means that it's going to put you in the high category at least. And the Pokemon is no different than the rest of this. And again, because you need more than one. These Pokemon are not common, and the farmers that raise them use them as their livelihoods. To get some of these Pokemon from any of those farmers, you're going to have to reimburse them for any money that they're losing by giving you that Pokemon. So getting 2 is going to put you in the very high category. Only way around that is to go catch your own, which I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Conclusion. These really seem like Pokemon that are designed for farmers. I mean, they need a bunch of space, you have to have multiples of them, and unless you're going into some real fancy training, you don't need to work with them a lot. If you're a farmer, then I can see these being a great Pokemon for you to raise and sell and make your living off. For the casual keeper though, then they aren't that great. The space and numbers that make them great for the farmers make them a bit of a pain to keep for the average person. But they are easy Pokemon to tame, and their diet is very simple. They are far from the most complex Pokemon that we've covered in these guides, so if you have the space for them, then these could easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the cute aquatic ice type Seal and its evolution Dugong. Have a wonderful night, everyone.